US President Donald J. Trump has dispatched his special envoy Steve Witkoff to Moscow, signaling a renewed and controversial diplomatic push to finalize a peace plan for the war in Ukraine. Across Western capitals, in Kyiv and beyond, the move has reignited tensions, doubts and debate, especially after a leaked call raised questions about how the plan has been framed behind closed doors. Sources close to US negotiations reveal that the backbone of the latest 28-point peace proposal, now under consideration in Geneva and soon Moscow, was drawn from a non-paper originally authored by the Russian side. That Russian-origin document proposed sweeping territorial concessions by Ukraine, including ceding control over occupied regions, a framework many saw as tantamount to implementing Moscow's long-standing demands. When early drafts of the plan surfaced publicly last week, the reaction was swift. US and European allies voiced alarm. Ukrainian officials rejected it, calling it biased in Russia's favor. And US lawmakers and diplomats expressed bewilderment that the administration would advance a plan so closely aligned with Moscow's prior demands. In response, the plan was hastily revised over negotiations in Geneva earlier this week. According to US officials, 9 of the most contentious points, those demanding immediate Ukrainian concessions, were cut or softened after heavy pressure from Kyiv and its allies. Still, the underlying architecture remains deeply contested. Key issues, territorial control, security guarantees, and the status of the occupied regions remain unresolved. Western capitals and Kyiv remain skeptical that Moscow will honor any accord that undermines Ukrainian sovereignty. Compounding the mistrust is a leaked recording of an October 14th call between Steve Witkoff and Yuri Ushakov, a top foreign policy aide to Russian President Vladimir Putin. In the call, Witkoff reportedly coached Ushakov on how to frame the Kremlin's pitch to Trump in a way that would be more palatable. According to the leaked transcript, Witkoff recommended that Russia's leadership adopt an optimistic tone, publicly praise Trump's prior diplomatic efforts, including a separate Gaza initiative, and present the peace plan as a win-win, effectively helping Moscow package its demands as concessions or compromises. In Washington and other capitals, the leak has triggered outrage. Critics say it reveals that US mediation has effectively become diplomatic coaching, blurring the line between mediator and advocate. Many see it as evidence that the plan may have been tailored more to suit Moscow's interests than to deliver a just and stable resolution for Ukraine. Moscow responded angrily. The Kremlin condemned the leak as unacceptable, calling it a form of hybrid warfare aimed at sabotaging negotiations. Ushakov said Russia did not authorize the leak and warned it would address the issue directly with Witkoff. Despite the backlash, the White House, led by Trump, has moved forward. Official statements describe the plan as modified and claim there are only a few remaining points of disagreement. Trump himself hailed the process as progress. According to US sources, Witkoff's forthcoming trip to Moscow is intended to iron out the last obstacles, while US Army Secretary Dan Driscoll heads to Kyiv to engage with Ukrainian counterparts. But for many observers, the balance of power in these negotiations remains deeply uneven. Russia continues its military operations in Ukraine even as talks proceed, a reality highlighted by the missile barrage on Kyiv on November 25, which killed at least 7 people, underscoring Moscow's willingness to keep up the pressure even during diplomatic overtures. Officials close to Kyiv argue that any peace agreement that fails to guarantee real security, territorial integrity and full sovereignty would amount to capitulation. Some European partners have echoed those concerns, warning that a deal skewed toward Russian demands could embolden future aggression. While US diplomats work behind the scenes, the Kremlin is not without its own anxieties. The public leak and the uproar it triggered has put Moscow on the defensive, prompting statements calling it sabotage. At the same time, Russian officials have insisted they have not yet reviewed a formal US proposal, even as they confirm a preliminary agreement for Witkoff's visit. According to Ushakov, there has been only ongoing contact, no substantive roundtable negotiations yet. That suggests Moscow may still be calculating how far to push or what to accept once the final draft lands. The coming days will be critical in determining whether Russia will treat the plan as a negotiating framework or demand a far more skewed settlement. Envoy trip to Moscow. Witkoff is scheduled to meet with Putin and senior Russian officials next week. The Kremlin says a preliminary agreement is in place. Ukrainian reactions pending. Ukrainian leaders are reviewing the revised plan with fresh input from Kyiv, but remain deeply sceptical about any terms that compromise sovereignty or entail territorial loss. Western pressure intensifies. European allies and US lawmakers continue to warn against cementing a peace plan that mirrors Russian demands. Diplomatic backlash is rising. Military risk remains. Russian attacks, including the recent strike on Kyiv, continue even as diplomatic talks proceed, underscoring the risk that any peace deal could be undermined by renewed aggression. The dispatch of Steve Witkoff to Moscow represents a bold gamble by Washington. It signals that the US, under Trump's leadership, is pushing hard to transform a controversial Russian-rooted proposal into an international agreement. But the journey ahead remains fraught with danger. The leaked call exposed a Kremlin-friendly playbook. Ukrainian distrust is deep. European allies are on edge. And on the ground in Ukraine, bombs continue to fall. If the coming Moscow meetings end in a deal, and only if that deal secures Ukraine's sovereignty, includes credible security guarantees, and earns buy-in from Kyiv, Washington, and European capitals, it could offer a pathway, however narrow, to ending years of devastating conflict. If not, the effort may end up as yet another failed diplomacy, with heavy costs paid not only by diplomats, but by ordinary Ukrainians still living under the shadow of war. As Washington presses forward and Moscow weighs its next move, the stakes surrounding this revised peace initiative could not be higher. The coming talks in Moscow will determine whether Trump's envoy can bridge a widening gulf of mistrust, or whether the effort collapses under the weight of leaked calls, geopolitical pressure, and an ongoing war that shows no sign of slowing. For Ukraine, for Europe, and for the United States, the next few days may decide whether this moment becomes a turning point toward peace or another reminder of how fragile diplomacy remains amid the thunder of continued conflict.